bioretention, or rain gardens, or whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of different names and formats for it. But so a definition and type, it's called shallow landscape depressions that receive stormwater from contributing areas and soak it in. I think soak it in probably should be part of that definition, but it's a matter of just capturing that water and getting it into the ground and kind of replicating what we're doing in a forest scenario. Small scale dispersed facilities, and there's many different types and different words we use for them. Bioretention cells, kind of generally just more of a pocket, but an engineered kind of pocket. A rain garden is another kind of format of that, but it's a much less engineered version. Bioretention swales, so again, more of a linear application that also conveys the runoff. Infiltration planters, much more the urban bioretention in a box kind of concept. And then flow-through planters are that bioretention in a box that also has an underdrain and it flows through that and mostly provides water quality. I think the key, what I would say about bioretention is there's a lot of different shapes and forms. Don't get hung up on them. If they have some of the same core elements, it's still bioretention. And analogy I use often is like fast food restaurants. There's some in particular I have in mind that they have this really wide array of menu items, and then you look at it, the ingredients are probably like 5 key ingredients. And really, like, the bioretention is kind of the macho burrito of that whole palette. It's got all of those ingredients in it. Things such as surface storage, soils, infiltration, retention, evaporation, all of those functions that we're looking at in most LID practices are concentrated into a bioretention cell. So here's a little bit of the run through of what those components are, what those ingredients are. Pre-settling, or the flow entrance, consideration of how water gets into these practices. They all have bioretention soil or amended soil that is mostly a composition of sand and kind of compost, organic matter, but it's also porous and drains flow through it. Mulch and compost, very important for vegetation establishment, weed management, and all of that. Native vegetation or water-appropriate vegetation, because it can be amended to handle other plants than just natives. Ponding area, it has the idea is, again, to store that water at the surface and let it get that opportunity to soak into the soils. Sometimes you can have an underdrain, again, and those are areas where you have tight soils, and you always have to consider the overflow, because oftentimes we're designing these practices for small storm events, and so the large storm events, we still have to think about where that water is going to go, or if this facility fails. Here's a little slide about bioretention versus rain gardens, because you'll see both terms thrown out there. I accidentally say rain garden all the time, and I usually mean bioretention. From the regulatory perspective, bioretention is usually what we're looking for. Essentially, the definition that we're looking for is generally an engineered practice. Bioretention has a lot more consideration of the structures within it. It may have an underdrain within it. It's designed for a particular performance level. For a rain garden, it's much more of a residential type application. It's basically a landscaped shallow depression that's graded on the site, and you're using rule of thumb or general rules to size that facility to handle the runoff and do what it can do. But you're not spending a lot of time engineering and analyzing the performance of those facilities. You're going to size a bioretention facility and do some analysis to optimize that facility. The other thing is maintenance. Again, rain gardens are very similar for bioretention, but somewhat less extensive and less maintenance, because again, you're not really relying upon that performance as much as more the aesthetic and making sure obviously that it's still draining, but it's not necessarily that higher level of maintenance to make sure that it's performing to what it was designed for. Benefits of bioretention, everything on the LID palette for the most part. Infiltration provides storage, filtration through the soil media, slowing of the stormwater flows. Think of it as a sponge. It'll take the water very early when it's dry, and it tries to hold on to that water until it gets saturated. And that causes a delay in that hydrograph and can really knock down peak flows extensively. It's also a landscaping amenity. So again, I talked about my experience where I'm building stormwater ponds. We're putting fences around, call them stormwater prisons. These are something that's integrated into the site, what may require a little bit wider areas of planters. And again, it can also be integrated with other LID practices, or I'd even say conventional practices. You can't get all the work done by low impact development practices or bioretention. It can still serve to downsize your downstream conventional practices if you still need additional flow control. It can be used in snow storage in cold climates. I've seen a lot of places that use that on the roadside applications where they're restricting parking. Normally they would just use the parking zones for their snow storage and switch that from one year to the other year. Oftentimes you can actually then just do your rain gardens there and push the snow into those areas. But you also do need to consider what's going to happen with the sediment and sanding that may be in that snow plowing area, and so it may actually put a little bit more of a load on those rain gardens. But again, as that snow melts, it's being mitigated through the bioretention soils. It's also good for protection of cold water streams that are sensitive to temperature changes. So runoff that comes off of a blacktop surface is really warm. And if it touches soil and kind of gets mitigated through that, even if there's an underdrain, that discharge is much cooler that goes to the streams. So it's a secondary benefit that's not in the codes, but it can be a great benefit for the streams and the habitat. Applications for them, I mean, there's numerous applications. Again, like I said, there's lots of different shapes for bioretention. You can use them on individual lots that just mitigate the roof and driveway areas or other impervious surfaces. Shared facilities where you have multiple lots. In the common areas between those shared facilities, there's a great spot where normally you would have landscape or some sort of vegetation in there. Just depress that zone and you can make it into bioretention. Loop roads, cul-de-sac. I mean, what I generally think of any other kind of unused space that you're going to use for a landscape amenity can likely be converted to a bioretention if you're thoughtfully thinking about your grading. Because again, you can't use the high points for bioretention, you can't get the water to it. But if you're thinking about that at the site planning stage, you can make those landscaping areas function for your stormwater. And again, along road right-of-ways and along roads, a lot of what I do is that, taking advantage of those vegetated planting strips and kind of inverting that road profile to where the road drains into those vegetated planting strips. Another one we've done is actually retrofitted existing detention ponds to have rain gardens within them. So a way to kind of enhance the performance of those practices. So still a centralized feature, but adding rain gardens to them is kind of fun to kind of renew that facility and add more benefit to it. Limitations of them. Generally, you're going to want to limit it to small drainage areas, because once you have a very large drainage area, you're going to have to start plumbing it. And once you plumb it and get into underground conveyance systems, it's going to be so deep that you're going to have to daylight it somewhere to get it to bioretention. And oftentimes that can limit kind of the aesthetic and the space available for bioretention. So you're often going to try to disperse bioretention amongst the landscape so that you can keep them shallow and keep them as amenities. There's obviously a potential impact on other site uses. You know, you may be trying to use that site or the space for something else, like parking spaces. So give consideration to the trade-offs of siting bioretention versus if you need more parking. But oftentimes when we're talking about the codes, you'll see that maybe parking requirements could be a lot more flexible if the code allows it. Designs with underdrains can result in conflicts with existing or future utilities. Again, once you get underground, you're going to start dealing with more infrastructure. The other aspect is you need enough grade to daylight or discharge those underdrains to some downstream conveyance system if you're going to need an underdrain. Make sure your site is suitable for doing bioretention, or more importantly, really infiltration. So here is a list of various required offsets from critical infrastructure that could be impacted by infiltration practices. So drinking water wells need to be 100 feet away from them. Usually 100 feet is the general rule for all of these, so stay away from springs used for drinking water. Known deep soil contamination, you don't want that water to mobilize the contaminated soils. Similarly, active or closed landfills, septic drain fields. Again, the setback's a little bit less, but still you need to stay away from those. And then there's a lot more local guidance on wellheads, on-site septic systems, basements, foundations, buildings. That's a big consideration. Obviously, you don't want to have secondary consequences of that water getting someplace you don't want it to go. So it's a very important aspect to understand what are that infrastructure that water can get into that you want to prevent. I think if you're downslope of the building foundation, you need to be 20 feet away. If you're upslope of the building foundation, you need to be 100 feet away. Native growth protection easements need to be away from those, and the top of steep slopes. Or consult the geotechnical engineer, because in some cases there may be some stability issues or not as much of concerns there. So if you're going to try to work closer with the steep slope, use your geotechnical engineers. Groundwater protection areas, not allowed if it will cause a violation of the groundwater quality standards. Depth to bedrock, again, you need to have enough space for that water to go. When water kind of is focused in an infiltration setting, it'll tend to mound that groundwater table. And so you need some space for that mounding to occur, otherwise you'll affect the infiltration capacity. So the general rules are 5 feet from the facility base. You need to be above that bedrock impermeable liner, so if you got like a hard pan underneath there, or you have high water groundwater, and it's a seasonal high groundwater, so making sure you understand where the maximum height of that groundwater can get to site those facilities. You can reduce that down to 3 feet on a case-by-case basis. Generally, that's if you have like consultation of a hydrogeologist or if you have a very small-scale practice that's not going to mound that much. Other general rules, infiltration rate and drawdown time. Try to be at least a ½ inch per hour, because that's going to assure that you can drain in 24 hours. You can push the limits to 1/4 inch per hour, but I'd recommend perhaps supplementing with an underdrain in those situations. And 2.4 inches per hour is that threshold where you might need to consider water quality. Oftentimes the bioretention qualifies for water quality, but make sure you're checking that when you have those high infiltration rate soils. And again, as a general rule, based on what was before there, soil groups, hydrologic soil groups, B and C soils are those ideal soils for doing bioretention. Another rule is that the whole system, not just the ponding zone, but everything in the soil needs to drain in 72 hours. Ponding zone, generally the rule of thumb is 24 hours. Design considerations for bioretention: erosion and sediment control during construction. Almost well over half, probably 2/3 of all failures of bioretention systems, if it wasn't a design problem, it was because something happened in construction. Too much sediment discharged to those practices, and they plugged up right away before the vegetation had a chance to really establish and maintain a natural system. So maintain good construction and sediment erosion practices, stabilize the upslope areas, and divert flows around those bioretention areas until they're stabilized. And even in some cases, until that vegetation has had a chance to have a little bit of growth and establishment, so that they can start functioning to break up the soil. Planting considerations. So soil moisture conditions. Bioretention is, you're going to enter extreme moisture variation for bioretention facilities. You're directing a lot of flow to them, so they will be ponded. So you need to have plants that can handle kind of having that wet feet for a short period. But they're also, in order for them to function, need to drain quickly. So they also need to be able to handle drought conditions. So that's kind of why native plants are one of those top recommendations for species, because that's what native plants deal with. Sun exposure, different plant palettes for whether it's in the sun or in the shade. Above and below ground infrastructure, especially this is with trees. If you have below ground infrastructure or above ground infrastructure, make sure it's got room to grow. And then site distances and setbacks from along roadways. I like this slide because it's showing a very typical application of bioretention, which is at the end of the block, which is usually the low end of the block, and also the end of the block that people aren't allowed to park near the intersection. But they need to see at the intersection. So in those cases, you need to consider the vegetative palette and make sure that it's low enough that people can see. More plant considerations: pedestrian use. So oftentimes if we are like in a planter strip between the sidewalk and the roadway, people are going to want to walk in those zones. So consider a plant palette that can handle that, or be very intentional about where you want people to cross. Adjacent plant communities and potential for invasive species control. Again, oftentimes they're next to grass, and grass can often tend to try to spread into the bioretention facilities, or even weeds will come into them. So give consideration to what those competing vegetation is going to be. And of course, visual buffering and aesthetics. Nobody's going to want a practice that's not going to look good, because it's just going to be abused over time. So considering how that aesthetic fits with the overall site or the community that's going to be around it. So there's lots of different resources out there for planting palettes and appropriate plants for those. Also, you can always consult local nurseries. They're starting to get really good on board with bioretention and rain gardens. So many of them are starting to develop their own palettes of here's some great plants for it. It's a great sales opportunity for them. Here's some just examples of different palettes you can take. This is from the Eastern Washington LID manual. And you can have different palettes for shade grown, high sun, different climate conditions, and also identification of appropriate street trees that could work within that zone. Not all trees can handle that kind of wet feet, and not all of those wet feet trees are appropriate for a street setting. So there's a lot of guidelines into it, and really when we get into the advanced and intro to bioretention, we get into a lot more of those details then. Other design considerations: mulch. Why do we have mulch on it? It reduces the weed establishment. It regulates the soil temperature, so it holds the moisture into those soils so it doesn't dry out so quickly. Attenuates heavy metals. Most of the studies of bioretention facilities show that that metals that's running off of impervious surfaces is retained and adhered to those soils, the high cation exchange capacity that's in mulch right at the surface, which is an important consideration if you're going to do maintenance. If you're just replacing the mulch, you're going to be taking care of a lot of that metals buildup over time. And it adds organic matter to the soil. So as it matures, especially this is compost mulch, as it matures, the biota kind of mixes that into the soil. Depth considerations: usually you want to have a max of 3 inches for compost and 4 inches for wood chips. Gravel is also an option, especially when you have a very dry palette. Using a gravel mulch can help retain moisture and hold back weed growth. And it's one I've seen used on a lot of Eastern Washington applications. Composition, again, compost. The reason why compost: one, it's the organic matter and the pollutant removal, but it's also because it doesn't float. So coarse wood chips will tend to float, and that causes just a mess. So you're seeing also if there are some shredded ones that are being kind of developed and kind of specced out that won't float as much, so that's an option. But you can just use the wood chip or more standard mulches on the side slopes where it's not going to get wetted and floated away. Basic maintenance for bioretention. This is just a general slide, but showing kind of three of the main categories of maintenance you need to consider in considering the life cycle costs of these facilities. So one is vegetated management, and there are very different levels of vegetative management you can take. You can just be dealing with just the performance of the facility and removing invasive weeds, all the way to an aesthetic level. And here we've got kind of three different kind of levels where every 3 years you just basically just kind of more remedial maintenance of that vegetation. Once per year as a medium level, or a high level of maintenance is basically coming back on average once per month. Or during those key growing seasons is really when you need to do a lot of that work. Replacing the mulch. Needs it for the weed, again, keeping up with the weeds and keeping the soil moisture in the facilities. Anywhere from once per year to once every 5 years. And then like I said, replacing the mulch can actually handle a lot of the toxics buildup in the soils, but there's really not a lot of great data about how quickly that builds up. There's no indications that it actually builds up to a toxic level over time. And in the last category, and it's called till soil here. I'm not sure if I quite agree with that as being the corrective maintenance, but it's really a corrective maintenance approach, which is basically that the system is plugged and you need to remediate it. I don't necessarily think tilling soil is always the best approach to restore the infiltration capacity, because you're going to have to take out all the vegetation and you're just going to be tilling it. You already have the fines in there. So replacing the soil or kind of remediating that way. And again, oftentimes we haven't really seen much precedent for how often that needs to occur. But this actually seems like a pretty conservative estimate that every 4 years to 10 years. I think oftentimes these facilities will last for quite a bit longer. There's a lot of precedents for ones that have been in place for over 20, 30 years. Establishment of the vegetation is very key in bioretention. Again, like you said, you're not going to just build a pipe and walk away from the construction site. You need to establish that vegetation. It needs a little bit of help in the first couple of years. And oftentimes, actually another consideration that's not on these slides, I don't think, is that you might not want to plant right after the rain garden is graded, because planting, oftentimes you want to try to get it closer to that wet season so that it's going to have the moisture and you don't have to irrigate it as much. So it's an important consideration in planning a project out and engaging the community or engaging the owners, is that the planting may have to be delayed and it's not going to be a finished product right away. If you're doing most of the work like in August, putting plants out there in the ground in August, you're going to just fry them unless you're irrigating them. So again, in the plant establishment period, here's some just general guidance for how often you may have to irrigate the trees. So in the first year, it's going to be a lot more frequent because those plants are just getting new and introduced to that environment, and they don't have as deep of a root system. So you may have to irrigate as frequently as once every 1 to 2 weeks during the dry periods. In this next couple of years, you may still need to irrigate every once in a while, but much more on a reactive basis in terms of, like, if you see signs of wilting or signs of stress on the plants, then you come out and irrigate them during those high dry periods. After 3 years, generally your maintenance is maintain good construction and sediment practices. Again, look for where you're getting sediment. If you're seeing sediment, try to find ways to manage that sediment, because if you get up too much sediment buildup that the vegetation and the root systems can't keep up with and keep breaking up, then you may need to try to find some way to manage and stabilize the site upstream. Trees, like Gretchen was saying, they may take up to 5 years to really become fully established, so they're going to need some care and maintenance going forward to make sure that they're appropriate, and if they're dying, you need to replace them. And again, the kind of key there is, especially if you're using a native plant palette, is they should be able to handle most conditions, but know your trigger mechanisms for when they're seeing too much stress. And then you might need to bring in a water truck or to bring in irrigation to help them out through those really extreme dry periods.